Hello. I thought we'd mix things up a little bit here and do a kind of talk through, walkthrough of this wee painting that I did based on Guild Wars 2. I'm an ArenaNet partner, which means I get sponsored to make Guild Wars content. And so I'm trying to get into the way of doing some more sort of sketchy, loose kind of concept art style painting stuff and sharing it online. So hope you enjoy. Let's start this thing off. Alright, so going into this I didn't really have any kind of plan, to be honest. I had been playing a bunch of PvP in the game, and I think that one or two of the loading screens, this sort of classic Guild Wars loading screens, always live in my brain rent-free pretty much. So this was my kind of lazy attempt to paint something that was kind of inspired by that stuff. I think a lot about Kekkei Kataki's work, and Theo Prinz and Daniel Dochu, etc. The classic Guild Wars 2 art team's work has always been very inspiring. It's kind of a mix of sort of loose painterly work, often with a kind of heavy photo bash element to give it a lot of sort of realistic texture, but maintaining the kind of looseness that I find really appealing in this kind of art. So this is basically, creating something similar to that. So to start out with, just kind of noodling some kind of loose shapes, kind of a classic concept arty kind of environment composition here, where we've got, our characters are sort of somewhat, are in the foreground, and then some sort of feature in the distance to latch onto. I pretty quickly ended up on this like dragon looking shape. I think again, like there's this Kekkei piece that was like in the back of my head when I started this, where you've got characters in front of a waterfall. So I was trying to find a way to combine that with the dragon head at this point. It's the morning, hence the coffee. I actually only just woke up and was like, I should totally do like a walkthrough video rather than just, put up the video with music. I'm kind of intrigued, like, for people watching, what kind of video content you actually enjoy the most. Like, do you prefer just music? Or is someone babbling away about the process helpful? Because honestly, this kind of approach doesn't probably take too long. I mean, this video is about 30 minutes long. The actual full time for this painting was about 3.5 hours, which is pretty good for, a kind of loose concept piece, like a kind of loose environment piece. Usually the goal with this kind of art, this is kind of like key art, I suppose. I'm sorry, I have coronavirus right now, which is really cool. Usually the goal with key art, which is a type of concept art, is to kind of sell the vision of a property. So if you're working on a film or on a video game, these kind of, painterly, expressive, loose illustration style concepts, the goal really is, it's like a piece of art that you can show the community or clients, and it'll kind of express the intent of the project, basically. This is what we want our world to look like, or this is what we want our world to feel like. So that's kind of where this stuff lives. Concept art is kind of a complicated profession because there's lots of different facets of it. This is one type of art, that is common for concept artists to do, especially early on in a project, and then also late on in a project. There's sort of two phases where you're either pitching the art style for the piece to the team, or you're using it as marketing material for, the game, or again the film, or whatever it is, later on in the production. During production, a lot of the work you're doing is design focused, so it's like designing characters and environments. I pulled up a reference there. It's a Jamie Jones piece that sprung to mind. I'll talk more about, the process as I go. We have 30 minutes. There's no hurry. But yeah, there's lots of different types of concepts. It goes from design into, creating model sheets essentially for 3D modelers to use to take your ideas and to turn them into, 3D, which is how most people interact with your art in a video game or film. Big slurp. So yeah, like I said, didn't really have any kind of idea going into this, but my process generally for stuff like this, where it's very open-ended, I didn't have a brief. This is just me kind of fannying around. I tend to just sort of sketch without reference initially. That way I'm not getting too inspired by anything before I've put anything down. But once I start working, that's when, once I slap in some colors, it's like, as soon as I did this, I immediately had about 10 images in mind, And that's the advantage of spending a long time, doing studies. This is why studies are good. And also just building up your visual library by looking at a lot of art and making a lot of art. As soon as I put those kind of yellowy orange tones in, I was like, oh, this reminds me of this, it reminds me of this Monset piece. So I've got that in the back of my head. Reminds me of this Jamie Jones piece, which is the one that I brought up on screen there. And sometimes I'll just bring those up to kind of grab some inspiration from them as I'm doing this. So at this stage I'm playing around with the sky, and I start messing around with some photographs. Again, Guild Wars style typically has a lot of photo bashing in it. It depends on the artist, of course. But to me, that kind of Kekai or Thomas Scholes or Daniel Dochu sort of approach has always been the kind of defining vision of what Guild Wars looks like to me. It's like that kind of, the photos are integrated but not so cleanly that it looks like a kind of perfect matte painting. It's got that kind of beautiful blend of, I can see the big brush strokes and I can see the kind of photos, and the way they live together is quite rough, it's quite loose. And I always love that style. I mean, when I'm working on Magic the Gathering and stuff, we don't work in that way very often. That's not really as much the style. But for my own personal work, a lot of which was inspired by, Guild Wars and games and some sort of game art like that, I really like to kind of mess around with this stuff. So I mean, already, we have the image is basically locked in at this point, right? The composition doesn't change much from here. And that's something I really like to do in general with paintings. I want to try and establish the composition, the kind of overall value range of the piece, and get the colors down as quickly as I can, pretty much. And once I'm happy with that, I can kind of walk away, take a break or whatever and come back. I took a few short breaks during this, but obviously it was quite a quick painting. It was only 3 hours or 3.5 hours, so I didn't need too many breaks. But yeah, I can walk away and come back, and I it's, the image is not going to change fundamentally at this point. It's just going to get more, more detailed, and that I find is quite an appealing way to work. It's quite an efficient way to work as well. Because if you're working in concept, working on a project, on a team, it's really helpful to be able to be efficient, I guess, to be able to sort of take something to 20% done in an hour, let's say that stage took me an hour basically to get to where I was saying. If you can get that to that stage in an hour, to a point where you could show that to a client, to be like, this is pretty much what it's going to look like, right? It's going to be basically like this. That means, in a day, you could do 4 of those, 5 of those, depending on, how long your day structure is. And then the next day you can go and render them out, which took, a couple of hours, basically. So that's why, efficiency is kind of important when it comes to concept art. So yeah, I brought in the waterfall texture. Obviously that stuff is very close to camera, so that's going to have the highest level of detail, which is why I wanted like a nice kind of chunky photo texture to use there. In the distance there won't be any photo bashing really, because I'm trying to really sell the concept of space. You know, stuff close to the camera is very detailed, stuff in the distance is pretty subtle. The value shifts are more subtle, especially in the dragon. You'll see that when I'm rendering the dragon later on. I kind of battle a wee bit with like how much detail I want to put into it. And the answer ends up being like not very much because I just don't want to over detail it. In terms of the palette I'm using, I started off, you know, purely kind of oranges and reds. I wanted to get kind of like a hot, warm feel to this piece. And I mostly stick to the mid-tones, honestly. Like obviously there's some higher values in the waterfall because they're showing off the characters. I want the most contrast to be, excuse me, to be around the characters. Because they're the heroes of the piece, right? So that's why there's so much contrast there with the kind of almost pure white in the water versus the quite shadowy characters. But I did start to integrate a little bit of kind of color contrast there. The sky there is just grey, but grey, just pure grey, plays very interestingly with orange tones. Basically, if your piece is predominantly orange and you put some grey into it, it's going to look like blue. It's a kind of old kind of painting technique. You see it a lot in artists like Thomas Moran, you know, who's my favourite landscape painter. Yeah, like grey is kind of wonderful. It's really powerful for games like Magic the Gathering, because you know, when we're working on Magic cards, we tend to try and stick to a sort of somewhat limited palette a lot of the time. I mean, obviously it depends on the artist, but if I'm going to paint a red card, I'm mostly going to use red. I don't want to use too much blue necessarily, unless obviously the piece really calls for it. And that's where grey can kind of come in, because grey is quite neutral, and it allows you to add coolness to those warm pieces. And vice versa, if you have a very cool piece and you add that same grey, it's going to look warm. So if you're doing a blue card and you want to add a bit of warmth to it without adding a bunch of orange, you just add grey and it looks warm for some fucking reason. So yeah, at this midpoint I'm really just experimenting with different photo textures. The way I kind of paint these in, there's a kind of a couple approaches. One that I just did there was I brought the color, the image in, and used the match color tool under adjustments to change the color palette of the photograph to the color palette of my painting. It doesn't always work perfectly, but for quick photo bashy jobs like this, it can work quite well, just for like changing that blue palette into the, you know, orangish palette or the reddish rusty palette that I'm using here. And then that allowed me to just paint that directly into the painting using masks. Always use masks when you're photo bashing. You can use the quick mask tool in your layers palette, and that lets you, rather than only being able to, you know, erase stuff, it means that you can paint stuff in using that mask and have a lot of creative control over it. You know, you can paint some in by painting with white, you can erase it again by painting with black. So masks are definitely your friend with this kind of work. And at this point I'm really trying to figure out this mid-ground here. Ended up being a kind of floaty island type thing, which is very Guild Wars, so that it kind of made sense. But I mean, this is a good example of, you know, the process is not always straightforwards. I really spent a while trying to work out what the hell I was doing with that mid-ground. Often the answer is just paint loads of clouds and have the islands kind of popping out, which is kind of what I did there. I'm not using any reference for these characters that I'm painting. I had in the back of my head just like a Norn kind of, you know, warrior and a Sylvari something. I'm more interested in the shapes than the specifics of the design. If I was going to take this further, what I would probably actually do is go and grab some proper references of, you know, Guild Wars characters and maybe bring in elements of their design. Again, that's the advantage of this kind of approach to painting. You know, we can really break this up into stages. You know, like I was saying, after an hour, I've basically got like a loose sketch that I can show to a client. After 3.5 hours, I have a pretty nice looking kind of key concept illustration, but it's obviously still loose. And then if I wanted, if we wanted to use this for marketing, maybe for a game that was like less kind of painterly, I could go away and spend like, you know, 2 to 5 hours just rendering the hell out of it, depending on what kind of work we're doing. Like I would totally use this approach for Magic as well. You know, a lot of the same techniques that I am using here, I will use when I'm painting Magic cards, including, you know, using photographs to add texture, and kind of the same approach to my time use as well. I still try and get stuff done pretty quickly so that I can iterate on it and add detail and so on. Now you can't see my layers panel here, but I'm really not using many layers at the moment. That's a personal thing. I have a traditional art background and I've always enjoyed, you know, not using too many layers, so I'm having to like paint onto stuff. Like if I want to do, like, for example, like change the size of something like I did there with that character's head, you know, I have to grab it and manipulate it and then repaint out stuff, which seems kind of inefficient. And I mean, it is a wee bit inefficient, but I just like the kind of end result, or the kind of feel that like texture is building up in the piece. You know, the idea that it's kind of malleable and you're leaving behind elements of kind of mistakes you made earlier. It's, I don't know, it sounds a bit wanky, but I just like the way that kind of comes out. And at this point, we're really locking in everything. Like it's working quite well. So I'm just starting to now add a wee bit more detail, especially to the foreground, because again, the foreground is where we want the most detail. The background elements, like the sky, is basically done. I think I do a little bit more noodling here and there, but like most of that stuff is done. So really, it's like cleaning up edges. I want to make sure that, you know, there's strong layering between the values. So basically the value range in this piece is going from, you know, very contrasty foreground. We've got that sort of black and white thing going on with the foreground. And then as we move back through the image, we kind of move through, you know, from like dark to light, essentially, you know. But it's a kind of way of implying that there is atmosphere in the environment, as there is in any environment. So things get lighter and less saturated as they move back into space. What the hell am I doing here? I started messing around with the idea of adding a wee bit of texture to the dragon here. I really wasn't sure. That was the next problem, right? Again, painting, you're solving problems the whole time. I was pretty happy with the midground now, like I kind of solved what was going on there. So my next big issue that I'm going to come to in a second here is what I'm doing with that dragon. Sorry, I have to take a break to cough. But apparently that's not what I'm doing right now. Apparently I'm just going to jump around all over the place and get back to that shortly. It's always funny watching your own paintings back and appreciating how unbelievably chaotic the process is. Just cleaning up edges here. Making sure that things overlap nicely is an important aspect to this. That's how you avoid tangents. Tangents are basically when two elements that are in separate parts of the composition either mimic each other in a way. So like, for example, if I had an arm here and then another arm back here that was following that flow, at a glance, it doesn't necessarily read very strongly. It would be more efficient if those two things were separate in some way, or overlapped. So that's what I was doing there with the sword. I was trying to make sure that the sword overlaps the character and has a wee bit of space away from the rock that they're standing on. It just helps to make sure that it reads clearly, that it's not in front in a certain way, or that, you know, it's not getting lost. Birds for scale, very important. Wouldn't be concept art without birds. All concept art has to have birds. I don't know if you knew that, but I just remember. And here we go. Now we're starting to reapproach this dragon a wee bit and just think about, you know, how much detail do I want to add to this? Do we want to see the teeth? Do we want to see the eyes? I actually wasn't really sure at this point. I think I may have just taken a break here. Glad I kept this in. Good shout, Paul. Love that. But yeah, the problem with things that are in the distance, when there's a lot of atmosphere in the environment, is that the value shifts between the sort of light areas and the dark areas are going to be really subtle. That's actually quite hard to paint. So I actually slightly exaggerate it when I'm sketching, and then I can always just reduce that detail again. Reduce the intensity of that. So for example, it's like, you know, drawing in black to kind of figure out the shadow shapes. Because you wouldn't see, we're not going to see too many highlights because this is all backlit. So drawing in black to do the shadow shapes, and then I can just like reduce the opacity down a bunch to get the final result. Here I've brought in a reference for the first time, like an actual color reference. That is a Thomas Moran piece. It's not the one I had in mind when I started, but I really like the color palette. Crucially, it's got some really nice grays and some pinks in it that I thought would be nice in here. And to experiment with bringing those colors into this, I actually did the same thing I did earlier with the match color thing that I did when I did the photo bashing. So I used, flattened my painting image, and I used the match color tool under adjustments and selected the Thomas Moran painting. And that means basically what it'll do is it'll try and match the colors in your painting to the target, right, the source. And then I just played with the intensity of that, and that gave me a version of the image that had like a bunch of those pinks in. It was a bit random, it wasn't perfect. So what I did then was, using a mask, just painted that in where I wanted it. It just basically added like a little bit more kind of pinky grayness to the image that I thought would help balance it out nicely. Here we are, just doing a detail pass on the characters. I wanted to do something with that helmet. It's not specific to Guild Wars, I was just kind of thinking about kind of Norn helmets with some horns and stuff like that. Just adds a bit more visual interest. And then back to the dragon, still just trying to work out what the hell to do with this guy. Now I did a wee bit of, render work on him a little bit ago. Started to bring out that tooth, which shortly I will kind of dig into a little bit more and actually define the mouth a little bit more. Again, I didn't want to over detail the dragon because it's meant to be kind of an evocative part of the illustration, but not necessarily the focus. Even though the composition is leading towards it, it's quite far back, so I don't want to add too much detail. I want to leave a lot up to the imagination, basically. And that's kind of the advantage of this kind of loose impressionist style, and it's I think why like Guild Wars 2 artistically is so successful is that it is very impressionistic, which means that you fill in the blanks, basically, you know. If everything's hyper real and super detailed, there's no room for imagination, or less room for imagination, I should say. There we go, I added a wee gap in the teeth there to let a bit of the sun kind of poke through. Here I'm just cleaning up the edges of the mountain and stuff as well. I noticed around about this point that like beside the waterfall, the difference in value between the foreground rocks and the kind of midground rocks is not super strong. You see here, I'm starting to pick up on that. So what I'm doing is I'm just bringing in more atmosphere to separate those even further. You can kind of see there that like the rocks now stick up a lot more, and I'm doing it with every rock, basically. Every part that juts out, I'll add a little bit of atmosphere behind it, going backwards through space, and that will give the impression that, you know, things are moving backwards. This kind of stuff is really useful when you're looking at an image at small scale, so again, really good for magic, but also if you think about how we view images most of the time now, it's like predominantly on your phone, or it's like a thumbnail on Twitter, or whatever the next app that replaces it is. I brought in a 3D model of a dragon there and just kind of threw it on the image to see if it would give me any ideas. It didn't. But again, I was kind of struggling with figuring out what I was going to do with this dragon head. So at this point, I've kind of accepted my fate that I need to figure this shit out. And I'm just kind of... excuse me. Just kind of noodling around here. Adding a little kind of chunky texture to the dragon. You'll notice I'm not zooming in at all in this piece, and that's actually really deliberate. I don't want to add too much detail to anything here, and by staying zoomed out, when it comes to painting stuff in the background, I'm having to use pretty big brushes, which means I can't add too much detail, essentially. So it's a nice way of controlling your level of detail. Again, if we were to spend more time on this and come in and do like a detail pass, that's when I would zoom in, but I would primarily do that in the foreground. That was me doing the color thing again, by the way, bringing in that Thomas Moran painting to get those pinks and greys and blues in there. I just did it again, basically, to see what it would do. And that's kind of the process. It's very kind of experimental. I just try stuff out, you know. They're all techniques I use in different ways in my work. You know, try out some texture, and I didn't like it. It was too contrasting. That's the problem with photo textures. That's the thing you have to be careful with if you ever do photo bashing. Obviously, real life is quite detailed, it turns out. So if you add like a detailed photo texture to your image, you have to bear in mind the rules I was talking about earlier with detail, where detail falls off as you go back through the environment, right? Like if you look at a mountain in the distance in real life, you can't see all those tiny details, things clump together. So when you're photo bashing, you need to think about that as well. You know, if I'm going to photo bash trees on the horizon, I should really use a photo of trees on the horizon, or use the photo as it is and then just simplify it by painting over it. Finally giving this boy an eye. I thought he should have an eye. Helps to kind of drive the focal point. And now I'm just playing around with little effects like, is there smoke coming out of his mouth? Does he have a nose? I don't know. At this point I throw a filter over this. So this is Akviz Artwork, which is a kind of concept art secret tool that no one ever fucking talks about. Which essentially is, it's just like an oil painting tool, basically. I'm actually using the gouache filter here. But what's good about it is it's good for reducing photo texture and good for reducing texture and adding a bit of painterliness, which is really helpful if you are photo bashing a bunch, or if you you know, if you're doing 3D work, for example, and you don't want it to look too 3D. It's good for both of those things. I personally quite like it because it just creates sort of chaotic brush strokes and kind of weird white edges to things. So much like with the photo bashing, I will apply that filter sometimes late on in the painting to see if it does anything cool, and then I'll just paint in those bits that I like on a mask. I actually didn't use it very much here, but I always like to check it out and see what it looks like. At this point we're almost done, actually. Just doing some sort of final touches here and there, checking out my layers, adding a googly eye, very important. And I'm just kind of zooming in a wee bit to sort of check around and make sure things are okay. Adding little particles. Always interested in adding sort of things that move in the image. You know, we have the birds earlier. We've got the cloak, the cloak or cape flapping in the wind. And then adding in some sort of wee particles and stuff as well. Bit of sharpening to kind of sharpen up some of those textures in the foreground. A little bit of color balancing just to kind of make it look good. And we're done. Here's the final result of that 3.5 hour painting. hope you enjoyed that. Once again, if you can let me know if you prefer this format or if you'd rather I just play music rather than having to listen to my fucking blabber for 30 minutes. Let me know what you like. And just want to say a big thank you to my patrons. Without them, I wouldn't be able to kind of do this stuff. And I'm trying to get into the way of doing more of this stuff. So if you like this stuff, you know, like the video, I guess that's probably a good thing. I'm going to try and use YouTube more over the next kind of few months. I've always planned to do more with the channel, but never really had the time. But thanks to Patreon, I can potentially make more videos and put them out here for free. So if you want to subscribe, you can do. It's patreon.com/PaulScottCanavan. You know, follow me on Twitter @abigbat, and share this thing around if you find it helpful or interesting. But that's enough of my shit. Thank you so much for being here. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one of these, I guess. Or maybe I won't if you tell me, actually, we fucking hate you, Paul. Peace.